Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Completed Life Lunch Hour series. My name is Sarah Kaskaden-Bechtel, and I am the Program Director of the Completed Life Initiative. Our lunch hours are especially to offer you a space as a member of our Completed Life community to engage with our Completed Life experts. For those of you watching the recording and who wish to attend our future lunch hour events, please sign up for our mailing list at our website, completedlife.org. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our featured guest for today, Professor Paul Menzel, who will examine the role and value of death in human existence. I'm also delighted to welcome back our wonderful moderator, Delano Kopru. Professors Menzel and Kopru are both esteemed members of our Completed Life Advisory Board. So without further ado, I will turn over the mic to Delano to take us away.
All right, happy Thursday, everyone. Hopefully everyone's doing well as we prepare this very special lunch hour. Our guest today, Dr. Paul Menzel, will present his distinctive, controversial views on four matters. One, the value/disvalue of death. Death is both objectively necessary for our existence and subjectively to each of us individually, the extinction of the universe. Two, having a life that extends over time, not just being alive at a moment, plays a crucial role in accounting for who we are, for why life is usually so valuable, and for why advanced directives are ethically compelling in the face of very enticing objections. Point three, in severe dementia, the subjective value of life, the value to the person whose life it is, diminishes to a sliver of what it was before. Thus, even if a severely demented person is content and apparently not suffering, a clear advance directive to do what will hasten death should be followed. This does not constitute discrimination against the cognitively disabled. And point four of our talk today, in severe dementia, a person's willingness to accept food and water by mouth almost never constitutes a relevant change of mind about a directive to withhold it. Dr. Menzel is a CLE Advisory Board member and Professor of Philosophy Emeritus, Pacific Lutheran University. He has published widely on moral questions about health policy and health economics, including Prevention versus Treatment, What's the Right Balance, published by Oxford in 2012. And more recently, about various end-of-life issues, a volume co-edited and co-authored with Timothy Quill, Thaddeus Pope, and Judith Schwartz, Voluntarily Stopping Eating and Drinking, a compassionate, widely available option for hastening death, will appear this July from Oxford University Press. So without further ado, we will turn it over to our esteemed speaker for this lunch hour, Dr. Paul Menzel.
Next slide, Sarah. Thank you all for being here. It's a privilege indeed to have this time to share with you. Delano will be asking some questions along the way, and I'll be taking a break. We'll be taking a break for your questions at various segments of this. I won't go through the whole plan for the hour with just myself talking, but there will be chances for you to ask questions at various points along the way. Delano's already noted the plan for the hour and articulated on it a bit. Next slide, please. The first topic that I want to make some observations about, and by the way, everything I say today is something that I have thought about more since coming on to the Completed Life Initiative board. It's been a very stimulating experience. So these are, in some ways, very long-standing views that I've had, but in other ways, spruced up, made more vigorous, refined, in some cases retracted just a bit, balanced, etc. But they're what's on my mind in the context of the Completed Life Initiative. First, some observations about death. On the one hand, it's the worst thing that can happen to any of us because in any subjective sense, it's the end of our universe. One person has even said it's the end of the universe because subjectively, we see the universe, and when with death, assuming that at least we're talking about the end of earthly life, that's the end of our universe. On the other hand, it's one of the very best things in our existence because literally without the mortality of the individual member of the species, accounting for evolution, we just would not exist. There would be no human species. We would not have evolved had the individual members not been mortal. So given those, both the worst thing that can happen to us and for the human race and for us too, because we wouldn't exist without it, the best thing death is, should we resist it or even rail about it? Should we accept it? Should we even welcome it? Should, even more than that, should we celebrate it? Well, all those things are plausible. And my view is that if you lose any of them, it's probably you probably narrowed your view unnecessarily. But these are often in real tension with each other as we subjectively, as we personally encounter death ourselves. Next slide. What is death the end of? Well, people say, of course, it's the end of life. But there's something more to be said here. It is not just the end of being alive. It is the end of a life. Now, being alive can occur at a moment. So no matter what condition you're in, if your life, being alive at that moment, stops, that's death. But having a life is different than just being alive. Having a life requires temporal extension, as a philosopher would put it, from the past and into the future, remembering yesterday and anticipating tomorrow. If we didn't have that temporal extension of our being alive, we would not think of ourselves as having a life, but we do think of ourselves as having a life. This will become very important when we get to the question of the subjective value of life in dimension. Next slide. Excuse me, we are going to pause here for just some questions on death itself. Go back to the previous one, Sarah. If there are any.
There is one question, Professor. Why is the temporal extension part of life forgotten?
Sometimes we forget the most ordinary things. I am unaware of some of the most constant everyday things in my life. This is true of all of us. I'm not a psychologist, and one would have to do some studies here perhaps to check out this claim, but my suspicion is we don't recognize, many of us at many times, in fact all of us at certain times, don't recognize this because we just assume it. It's so much a part of our lives. I mean, I call my son, or he calls me. There's assumptions all over the place by him about my having a life, by me about his life. We can't have any conversation that does not have as an assumption and even awareness in the background that his life is temporarily extended and that mine is too.
Would you mind parsing in a little bit more detail the distinction you're drawing here? And I believe it's a very important one between um, between being alive versus having a life.
Well, it is said, for example, that all life is sacred. Whether that's in a theological version or not, I think we all do think that to some extent. But what is it that is sacred? To the person whose life it is, the life they have is very important, not necessarily just being alive. Both can be very important. But as we'll see when we get to the problem of advanced directives, it's going to be very important to distinguish just being alive at the moment and having a life. It'll be absolutely crucial. In fact, I would claim that we would put no stock whatsoever in advanced directives for anything, even advanced directives of the most acceptable sort, like refusing life-saving treatment. We would not accept those advanced directives. We would not even think they were important if we didn't have this notion that that what we have is not just being alive at the moment, but having a life. That'll become clearer later in the presentation.
Understood. Just a couple quick more questions, and we will continue on our way here. But a couple of points. One that comes up in the chat is would living forever be a better alternative to death? And to go along with that, I think Deb picks up on the trail very well. Isn't it also true that the person lives on after death in the minds of others?
Yes, both of those. Yes, we live on in the minds of others, very definitely. In fact, there have been some very lengthy explanations about that being a very important part of our immortality. But notice that it is not at all incompatible with the biological death of the individual member of the species. And it shows the fact that, in a sense, we have that immortal life, shows that what is being remembered by people who remember us in that sense of the life we have after our deaths. What's being remembered is the life we have. It is not, people don't remember us just being alive at a moment. Even when they do remember very particular and poignant moments and memorable moments, they remember them in the context of the life that we had.
Absolutely.
Would we be better off if we lived forever? I mean, on Earth? Well, you can argue that the human race would go extinct. We wouldn't evolve. We couldn't acclimate over. Oh, this would be over, millions of years. Probably we would go extinct. We may go extinct anyhow, but it would be for other reasons. Mortality, the individual member of the species, is extremely important. And if you want to read a fascinating account, José Saramago, the Portuguese Pulitzer Prize-winning author, has a book called Death with Interruptions. It's a stimulating, fascinating, fictional account of what happens when death stops. It's havoc all over the place.
I've just added that. I've just added that to the chat. Saramago is a very impressive writer. But let's continue, shall we?
Yes. Next slide. The value of life is going to become very important in end-of-life decisions. We want to die not too soon, of course, but we also want to die not too late. And discerning the point at which it's proper for us, not just proper, but that we want to die, is contingent heavily on the value of life. I won't claim that it's the most important aspect of the value of life because it's not the only one, but I will claim that it's a very important aspect of the value of life, and that's the value we might call the subjective value of life. the value of life to the person whose life it is to that person, for them, in their experience, with their values, etc. Now, on the one hand, when you really absorb this subjective value of life, the value of life to the person whose life it is, we get different effects. In some sense, this raises the value of life. In another respect, as we'll see in the subsequent slides, it lowers the value of life. Because the value of life, to me, is always a contrast with dying. What could the value of life be if it weren't the contrast with death? Because it is in seeing myself as possibly dead that I have a sense of the value of my life. Some Buddhists are fond of saying it's very important to think about death every day. And one of the reasons is that's how you appreciate life. Now, the comparison with death isn't just sort of a general point. There are also specific reference points, what psychologists call reference point effects. If I have very little time left in life, say 1 month, the value of that month assumes disproportionate value compared to the value of a month of life if I had assessed what living from March 4th, 2021 to April 4th, 2021, back 5 years ago when somebody said, well, how much difference would it make whether you lived 5 years and no months or 5 years and 1 month from now? And I would have said, very little difference. Even a whole year added doesn't make as much difference to me before, because I've got a whole 5 years left. But when I have only a month left, the reference point becomes different. The reference point is death a month from now, or death now. And how important is that remaining month of life to me at that point when there's a critical decision to be made, perhaps, about whether I live 1 more month? That month becomes immensely important. Also, sometimes when we definitely see the value of our life, the quality of our life is lower, we adjust to it. People who are become disabled in the sense of paraplegic or quadriplegic, it can be disability of mental sort, not just physical sort, they will accommodate to a new reference point after a while in their life. And it is a very well documented psychological effect that they see the value of their lives with their, what they would have said beforehand would be a lower quality of life, and which others say is a lower quality of life, but they say the value of being alive for me is just as high now as if I had the function of all 4 limbs. And we can understand why. We put ourselves in their shoes. They're quadriplegic, let us say. Well, of course, life. I mean, we think about it for just a moment and we can see that that's true. Next slide. Now, the value of life in dementia is also surprisingly high in one respect, because if we have less cognitive capacity, we adjust to that, and at a certain point, we are not angry at it, we just accommodate it, we just accept it. Maybe we don't have enough cognitive capacity to be angry about it anymore, whatever the reason. But on the other hand, there's also a sharply diminished value, because we cannot, at a certain point in severe dementia, we cannot anticipate tomorrow or remember yesterday. But if we can't anticipate tomorrow, and when we get to tomorrow, we can't remember that we survived from yesterday. And those are both true in severe dementia in terms of just cognitive capacity. People live in the moment only. They don't live anticipating tomorrow, and they don't live remembering yesterday. In that state of mind, what is then the value of surviving to the person whose survival is of that sort, who is missing that anticipation of tomorrow, and when they get to tomorrow, any memory of yesterday? It is, of course, still some value, the survival in the moment, But as you and I think of our survival, I think it's just very clear that I hang on to life now. If something threatens my life, I'm really hanging on to it. Why? Because I can see the future that would be lost if I died right now. It has to have that temporal extension for it to have great value to me. When that temporal extension, subjectively, to the person whose life it is lost, then I would argue that the value of survival to them, is very low. Now, this is a highly controversial view, at least in some circles. I think it's a quite commonsensical view. But I have to try to persuade, in certain circles, I really have to argue long and hard and patiently and as personably as possible to get in the shoes of the other person who doesn't accept this.
Paul, we weren't scheduled to stop here, but our friend Dean raises such a fascinating point that I think we should maybe
Well,
now will be a time to kind of take it on.
Let me just show 2 slides of a person in dementia. The slides of Margot Bentley. If you doubt that this is true and the struggle about living into severe dementia, the well-known case of Margot Bentley in Vancouver, British Columbia, a woman who died in 2016 after 17 years with Alzheimer's. Here she is in 1999 in her mid-60s, soon after she was diagnosed. She was in severe dementia for 7 to 9 years before she died in 2016. There's always dispute about what constitutes the point at which you get into severe dementia. Next slide. This is her 5 years before she died, in the middle of that 7 to 9 severe dementia stage. She continued to be fed at that time by being prodded with a spoon up to 7 times at that moment, being prodded, until she opened her mouth and curried food was scraped in. Now, I don't want to say that Margot Bentley at that point there was no value to her for her life. But the interesting part for our later discussion is she had an advance directive. Actually, it wasn't perhaps clear enough on oral feeding, but her daughter tried to get the oral feeding stopped and couldn't. And it went to several layers of court decision in Canada, and she never succeeded. The daughter never succeeded in getting her directions followed. Now's the time for the break.
So many great ideas here. And I definitely see how your notion of temporal extension applies in this case as well. But what role does religion play in determining a subjective value of life?
Well, it certainly determines a role in relation to beliefs in an afterlife. That is individually conscious afterlife. That is a continuation of the personhood of the earthly life. But the interesting thing about that, many people have made this comment, is if that life is so valuable in being an extension of the current life, then why do people try to stay alive here? Well, there's a theological answer to that, even in the most immortality emphasizing religious views. But it's still, I think, a legitimate question to ask. Not that it doesn't have answers within the theological perspective. Now, as to the sacredness of life at every point, I think we could all agree on that. But the question is, for the person whose life it is, if they don't believe in a personal immortality, which would make all of life, even life in severe dementia where there wasn't the temporal extension subjectively to that person at that earthly person at that time, there would still be temporal extension of another sort. But subjectively to that person, if they're not aware of that temporal extension at the point, then the value to them of their life at that point is arguably considerably lower. But this is a delicate matter. I mean, we don't want to say that value is nothing. We never want to say that. And that's why the later problem of advanced directives, then self, now self, that we'll get into is in fact a significant problem. I do believe it's a significant problem. So this isn't just, it isn't easy to just say, well, Margot Bentley has no life. So of course there shouldn't be any controversy about stopping feeding. She still has a life. The question is, what is its value in relation to her values?
Right. And I suppose another point to this as well is the idea of mindfulness, of being in the moment. And for Buddhists, Buddhists do attempt to live in the moment, as Rebecca Brown reports, being present and things of that sort. And life for Buddhists is a series of future present moments. So is there a conflict here or contradiction in your
No, I mean, one version, don't want to say the Buddhist view, because there is no one
Understood.
view here, but the Buddhist who says it's important to think about death every day, and that same person says it's really important to be in the moment. To be in the moment, you have to think about death. Can you really value the Buddhist point in part? I think the very commonsensical point, while we can understand it, is if we don't think about death, are we really valuing our moment now of being alive? The contrast with death is very important in our own absorption, our own awareness that we have for the value of our lives.
Understood. And a very thoughtful pause there as well. Shall we continue?
Yes.
Just before we move on, there's another question. How do we know if someone is peacefully meditating inside, or values, or have their values changed in end of stage Alzheimer's? So just to kind of clear that question up a little bit, how can we determine the distinction between someone meditating, in the case of Miss Bentley here, or knowing the inner life of this person, as opposed to dementia?
It's a very important question, and we certainly don't want to get glib about quick judgments that this person has no inner life, subjective life to herself. But when you do a post-mortem on a person who's died in severe, really severe advanced Alzheimer's, like Margot Bentley was, and I don't want to claim, because I don't know whether there was a post-mortem done on her, but there certainly have been on many other people who died. And unless we just don't believe there's much connection between the physiology of the brain and states of consciousness, and I certainly do believe there's a lot. I think there's a lot there we don't understand, as well as a lot that we do understand. But the brain, the cognitive center, we do know what the cognitive centers are. It's possible that there's some cognitive centers that we don't know of yet. But to the best of our available knowledge now, a person who is in severe dementia is just such withered centers of cognition in their cortex that we have every reason to believe that their consciousness is extremely limited. It's not zero. It's clearly not zero. So her reactions may not be only reflex. Some people have claimed that opening the mouth is a mere reflex, and she is completely unconscious of anything related to food when she gets prodded with the spoon to open her mouth. But I don't want to make that claim. She may be minimally conscious, but the question is, what is the value to her of her life at that moment? I think we have enough knowledge to say the extension of her consciousness and awareness of temporal extension is very, very low, if anything at all. That is, she can't anticipate tomorrow or remember yesterday. And given that, I would say, argue further that the value of her life is not, it's not zero to her, but it's It's very low. And when we try to weigh that against, and we'll get to this in the advanced directive, against the value of her previous direction, which was insistent on her not being kept alive in this kind of state, then we've got reason to respect the directive instead of respect her current minimal subjective value of life. Now, all that changes in a certain context in which we see the value there still being the value of the soul that is going to have an afterlife. It can change a lot.
Well, we have a very on the question of value, we have a very robust question from audience member Ki Okato, which I would just like to read and share with you as we stay within this philosophical segment here. It reads as follows: we value the ongoing impact of each person upon us. The presence of the deceased among us seem to be vividly experienced beyond static concepts of memories, but more so in our organically growing stories affecting our present life beyond religious cultural differences. And here are a set of two questions. After our death, are we staying alive in our loved ones' stories? And the second question, which is really compelling, how does the essence of our individuality and such a relational dynamics in the web of relationships musically resonate with our lives?
Relationships are very important. Some people have made the claim. Richard Dees, a philosopher at University of Rochester, has a very fine paper on what is our life after we die. Not assuming a heavenly immortality, but just earthly life after we die. And he argues, and I think he's correct, that for a variety of reasons, we do have a life after death. People talk about our lives after we die. They can injure us after we die. There's such a thing as post-mortem harm, posthumous harm. If somebody stands up at my memorial and starts and tells all the terrible things that I did in my life, including things that are false. Suppose somebody makes false claims. The reason that's a harm to me is that my life still lives on in the lives of others. Now, how can my life be my life if it's in the minds of others? Well, take my life now. My life now is very importantly affected by how I see my life in the minds of others, or just we make all kinds of unconscious assumptions here. How bad would it be if I were to die right now? Well, I can't think about the value of my life, even to me, without thinking about the value of my life to my sons and my daughter and my spouse. That's part of the subjective value of life to me. It's part of my view of my temporal extension, is my relationship to them and their value. It's a kind of wonderfully revolving circle here. My value, the value I put on my life is partly reinforced or increased by the value they put on my life. And in turn, the value they put on their lives is reinforced by my value that I put on their lives, and that I put on their lives as part of my life. I mean, we get this wonderfully rich interrelationship reinforcement.
Yeah, absolutely.
The notion of having a life as distinct from a moment of life and having temporal extension and the subjective value of that is very much inclusive of these relationship points.
Exactly, and you anticipated where I was heading, and you also anticipated a question that that Deb Love raised about the capacity for temporal extension. And her question is, if we lose the ability for temporal extension, do we have a life?
Sure. It's a very withered life. I would call it a withered life. It's not no life. Life in which we're not aware, we have no awareness of tomorrow and no memory of yesterday when we get to tomorrow, is not no life, but it's a withered life. And some people object to the claim that it's a withered life. All lives are of equal value, no matter what the capacity, cognitive as well as physical. I certainly agree that that's true of the physical limitation. As to cognitive limitation, I would argue that the subjective value of life, though it's still there, has withered when you lose that temporal extension. But furthermore, a life with, in this case, severe dementia, years of the person subjectively valuing really only life of the moment because they don't have the ability to anticipate tomorrow and remember yesterday when they get to tomorrow. That part of their life it is part of their life. That's why a memorial for a person who's lived 7 years in severe dementia is a different memorial because their life has been changed by that. And if they had a strong advance directive not to live into those years, it was not the life that they wanted.
Have you seen that happen?
Both types, and believe me, a memorial for a person who's been that way for years, and who didn't want to be in that life. That's a sad memorial. Not just sad because the person dies. All memorials are sad in that sense. It's more sad yet. And people who haven't experienced the difference between those two kinds of memorials, I just hope they could, and then I think this point would be more widely absorbed.
Thank you, Professor. For our audience members, there are a few more questions I realize on this point, but we will get to them towards the end. But in the interest of time, I think we should move forward here.
Next slide. Now, advanced directives. One of the things that I've spoken to in a lot of my writing in the last 5 years is advanced directives to withhold food and water, that is, food and water by mouth. It's challenging. It's more difficult than withholding artificial nutrition and hydration, which is so commonly perceived and correctly perceived as a medical treatment, whereas feeding people orally is typically not seen as medical treatment, though I would claim it's the equivalent of that at a certain point. There are two challenges here. If the person swallows the food that is offered, have they changed their mind about the directive? Suppose they had a directive that said, when I get to that point of needing such a manually assisted food feeding, where you have to hold the spoon to my mouth repeatedly to get me to swallow, don't feed me anymore. A very clear advance directive. If they actually accept the food, like Margot Bentley did, she could be prodded to open her mouth and swallow. Has she changed her mind? Well, change of mind would change the directive. If she changes her mind about the directive, then she has revoked her earlier directive and said, in effect, I want to live by being fed. But you can't revoke a directive, certainly in any legal sense, and I think in any moral sense either. You can't revoke a directive if you don't have the capacity to understand the directive that you're revoking, and the capacity to understand what you're replacing it with, whether that's no directive at all or a revised directive. But clearly the person who wrote the directive, we'll get to this point later, I think, does not have enough of a mind to have changed it. But of course, the then self who wrote the directive is competing here with the current self who wants to eat. And that still is a big challenge. Next slide. As I jumped ahead in my previous comment, at some point in dementia, one becomes no longer capable of changing one's mind about one's directive because one doesn't have enough of a mind left to change, as Ronald Bergman has put it a decade or more ago. This does not mean that one doesn't have mind left and that one has no cognitive states like perhaps wanting to eat. But it does mean that one isn't competent to revoke one's directive. One has passed the point where one is competent to do that. But even if that's true, and this person by swallowing has not in any sense revoked their directive, they don't have enough mind to revoke their directive, left to revoke it, does their willingness to eat still invalidate their directive? Not because they revoked it, but for some other reason. This is where we get to the then self, now self problem. Next slide. Dementia does radically change the author who wrote the directive. They don't remember writing their directive. They don't care about their autonomy anymore. And they don't, let us suppose, if they're not suffering, and many people who are in dementia, severe dementia, are not suffering. They don't find life unbearable. So one person very noted in the literature, Rebecca Dresser, has argued that therefore we should scrap advanced directives. She makes this point generally, not just about directives addressing what to do in severe dementia. We should treat the patient only for their current best interest, not their previous wish, in which case the advanced directive becomes superfluous. This is, in ways, an appropriate point. That is, the person doesn't remember writing the advanced directive. They don't care any longer about autonomy, and they don't find their current life unbearable, if in fact that's true. If they did find it unbearable, then on the basis of their own best interest, we should perhaps stop life-sustaining treatment, stop feeding them, whatever. But if they're not suffering, they don't find life unbearable, and their best interest would be just be in continuing their life now, not abiding by their directive. So advanced directives, Dresser argues, are in general irrelevant. They're superfluous, or they're in fact downright misleading because they want us to do things that the current person doesn't want. Next slide. But we need to refine this problem. The person who wrote the AD, the advanced directive, wrote it because she had a conception of her life. She didn't write it probably, at least if she writes one not for her life not to be continued into years of severe dementia. She didn't write it because she thought that at that point she would be suffering in severe dementia. If she knows the life in dementia well, and many people who write these directives write them because they've had direct experience with loved ones or close friends in these states. They know that they get to a point, the person gets to a point where they're not suffering. So she's not writing the advanced directive to end her life in the future, to end her life at a certain point, because she thinks she's going to be suffering. She wrote that directive because she had a conception of whether her life would be better living into those many years, or whether it would be worse living into those many years. And she had strong conviction, based on often very good experience up close, that her life would be worse. Her life to her and her conception of her life would definitely be worse. Now, Nancy Roden, soon after Dresser made her point that advanced directives were irrelevant or worse, came back with a very cogent reply. So that position would amount to treating the person as if they'd never been competent. And we should never treat a person who had previously been competent and who wrote such a clear and strong directive as a person who's never had that life, never wrote the directive, never was competent enough to write it. So the person who wrote the directive lives on. The person we're treating now is the person who wrote the directive. That's part of the current person. And we can accept that only if we see the current person as living a life, not just being alive at the moment. So Rodin's point is really the same point as what we have that we most value is a life. And it's spoken to by the advanced directive, even though now, the now self in the moment, isn't even aware of that directive. Because it's still the same life. It's Aunt Mary, or Mother Sally, or Father Charles. That person, we don't say that's no longer Mother Sally or Father Charles. We don't say that. I mean, the reason we care about this person, we visit them in the home where they are for the demented. We visit them because they're our parents, or whatever the relationship be. So that doesn't obliterate the then self, now self tension, because the person we're caring for is still this person who is willing to eat, or even grimaces a bit when they're not fit. But it greatly reduces it because it flips us back, Rodin insists, to seeing this person as the life that they were encompassed by their previous competence and advanced directive. Time for questions?
Yes, there's so many wonderful ideas that come forth here. I guess one question that really gets to the core of this comes from one of our audience members in terms of who determines, and this is a very complex question, but who determines the patient's best interest?
Well, it's not an easy thing to determine.
Yeah.
Rodin's point would be that it is not determined simply by looking at the person at the moment. Because the person's best interest is the best interest of a person. And a person is a person with a life, not just a person who's alive at the moment. Now, who is to determine that? When you've lost the ability to speak for yourself, that's why you wrote your advanced directive. So that becomes an important part. But an equally, and many would argue, and I think I would tend to agree, more important element is who speaks for you. That's your proxy. If you've appointed your proxy, and clearly in appointing them your proxy, have given them the authority to fill in the gaps that will inevitably occur in interpreting your advanced directive, no matter how clear you tried to make it. You appointed them your proxy with their knowledge of you. You appointed them because they knew you well, and you trust them to implement your advanced directive. But there are going to be gaps in your advanced directive. You never write an advanced directive that deals with every conceivable situation in detail. So they're going to be important in interpreting the directive. And you need to say in appointing them your proxy that you have confidence that they know what you would want when they interpret your directive and interpret your interests at the time. But they need to determine your interests, not some outside party, not some party going to court to block your decision because they think it violates the sanctity of life. Because on their view, it violates the sanctity of life, but not on your view. And your proxy is legally obligated not to, they're in fact not a faithful proxy if they don't try to see what you would want. That's the substitute judgment test, which inevitably gets put into this discernment of what is in your best interest.
Well, what about from a nursing perspective? Like, for example, if you are um, administering care to an individual, and you happen to offer a bit of ice cream or something of this sort, and the patient is accepting of that, is that a change of mind in your opinion?
Well, no, I've gone over before. At this point, the person doesn't have enough mind left to change their mind about their directive. But the tension between then self and not self is still very real. That person seems to want to eat, and undoubtedly does in some sense of want. It's a limited sense of want. It may be partly reflex, it may be even mostly reflex. But they accept food in a certain sense, then they do want to eat. And I, if I'm the nurse assistant or the assistant in the care home, who patiently, laudably, so patiently, so artfully feeds them every single day like this, of course they see the current patient, not the past person who wrote the directive, as the patient they're caring for. But that's why we have a proxy. And just as healthcare providers came to accept the refusal or withdrawal or withholding of life-saving treatment by advance directive, at a certain point in time, 50, 60 years ago, advance directives were not accepted because the person wasn't competent anymore there to check. We couldn't check whether they changed their mind, some people said. Well, we nonetheless came to accept advance directives, and caregivers came to accept the advance directives, not violating their oath to keep the person alive, because the power of the advance directive is that they were a competent person. They wrote this directive. They wrote it clearly. They entrusted its implementation to a proxy. And even that faithful, admirable assistant who keeps feeding this person is no longer obligated to feed them. It's difficult emotionally for that person to accept. And it's even difficult for us to try to impose that decision on that person because we know how faithful and how loving they've been to this person. And we don't want to destroy that love and that faithfulness in them. This is a difficult issue. One way that some places have tried to ameliorate it a bit is by putting pictures of the person in the nursing care home, where this is occurring, of the person's previous life. In VA settings, institutional settings, they will put pictures of the person when they were a soldier or when they got an award after they were discharged, to show the current caregivers what some of this previous life was that this patient they're caring for had. And anything that can be done to get the current caregiver to see the larger life of the patient they have. This can be done by relatives and loved ones who visit. It has to be done delicately, to be sure, but it can be done. And I've seen it in one case, elder home, where I know some people well. I've seen it done magnificently well. That is the connecting of the current caregivers who didn't know the person when they had their quote full life with the life that this person has is still the life of the person they're treating. Very important.
Yes, is this part of compassion, you would say?
Oh, definitely. And it's compassion not just for the person that's being treated, it's compassion for the people who are treating them, who are helping them, who are feeding them. And compassion, shouldn't know any limits. We shouldn't say, oh, we don't need to be compassionate toward the caregivers here. We're only compassionate toward the person who's being cared for. Well, wait a minute. How far would we get in life if we saw things that way? It's not a good way to live. It's not. If I'm visiting my severely demented mother or sister or brother in this home, and I'm not compassionate toward the person who patiently and lovingly feeds him or her every day, I'm a rotten human being in that respect.
One further question, and then we'll then we shall continue. So here's another question, Professor. Would it help if all these decisions are divided into whether the action will prolong life or prolong the process of dying?
Maybe I'm misinterpreting the question, but I think that there's an assumption here that prolonging the process of dying is not necessarily good.
I would.
But if what we're doing is prolonging the life of the person, because they still, because as part of that life, continuing to live now is valuable, then yes, we should continue their life. But maybe continuing to live now as part of the life is not valuable. If it's not valuable, when we see this as part of the life, and go back again to the question, how do we see the life at the memorial? Because we're celebrating or grieving. We're grieving the end of the life. We're celebrating the life at a memorial. And maybe we don't grieve the end of the life much at all because the end of the life was a blessing. On the other hand, at such a memorial, even though we know that dying then and not later was a blessing, this happens in many cases. Not all, to be sure, or only all. That is where we see, many people see, the ending of the life as a blessing. We don't stand up and go, rah, rah, death, because death is always sad. It's the absolute end of that person's subjective life. And that's always sad. I mean, think about it in our own case. I mean, that's the prospect that I would die tomorrow, even when dying tomorrow is a relatively good prospect, is still something that's bracing, because it's the end of my universe.
Let's continue.
Next slide. Now, I think there's a resolution to this dilemma. I've already breathed it in a way. In severe dementia, there's little anticipation of tomorrow and little memory of yesterday. So what is the value of survival to this person now? There's still some value, but it's withered. And at some point, if we're considering the life of the person, that is, a person who was competent and who did write a very strong directive and had views about how their life would better end rather than end in a worse way, then we should respect the person who wrote the advance directive, because that is still the person before us. Because what the life is in front of us is the life of that person who wrote the directive. It is not just, oh, the person doesn't remember their directive now. The person in front of us is not a person who wrote the directive in terms of the person now. No, the person now is the person with a life, and the life incorporates the time when they wrote that directive. That's why it's very important that when the value of survival to this person now momentarily withers, as I argue that it definitely does in severe dementia, then the weight of the directive and the person who was competent and who wrote it, which is still the life of this person in front of us, is still Father Charles, who wrote the directive. Then, and I'm the proxy, which needs to see to the best interest of that person now. Then I think we can see the end of the life as actually doing that person what they want, what was wanted for the, what is for the best value of their life. But that doesn't mean we jump up and down at the memorial and celebrate the end of their life, even when we do know it was a blessing. Now, I don't think we would have these strong convictions, or I wouldn't have this strong conviction about the power of an AD advance directive in this situation if I didn't see this notion of what is the value of the life we have? It's the value of a life. And the completed life initiative is so clear in focusing on that dimension, because you can't have the notion of a completed life if you don't have a notion of a life. And so the very existence of this organization is premised on the fact that we have more than moments in life. If we didn't have more than moments in life, there would be no life to complete. There would be an end to life, but it wouldn't be a life that's completed. You have to have the temporal extension and the notion of a life if you're going to complete it. So when I learned about this organization and was invited to consider being a more integral part of it in the advisory board, it didn't take me long at all to say, wait a minute, there's something really good about the very assumptions that are being made by this organization in coming into existence. And I certainly celebrate Faith Summerfield for having the vision to see that.
I will add this.
In a sense, it is completed life to the rescue here. And that's what gets us, that's what helps us resolve this then self, now self dilemma in dimension.
On the Completed Life Initiative blog, Professor, you write eloquently and elegantly about these matters. And one phrase you mentioned consistently is that death can protect your life, right? How would you mind unpacking that for us, taking us through that?
Suppose I enter severe dementia, or I'm on the edge of it. And I do have a very strong and clear advance directive about not keeping me alive going into those years. If you're going to, and you're my proxy, Delano.
Yes.
And if you're going to, what can you do to preserve my life? Well, we might say nothing, because the decisions you're in charge of making, given that I appointed you my proxy, are decisions about dying now rather than not. But if you let me die or carry out my directive in such a way that I do die, you've not just ended my life, you've preserved my life. Because my life was the life of a person who wrote that directive and who said that his life would be less valuable if he lived years into that severe dementia. Now that's me. That's not everybody. I don't want to say that this is a decision that other people should make. What I'm arguing for is that individuals should be allowed to carve out their own space for how they see the value of their lives. And my life, I see as more valuable if I don't live into those years. You're in charge of carrying out that wish of mine. And at a certain point, it doesn't compete with enough value of life to the current person, subjectively and momentarily, to outweigh the directive and my life. My life is the life with that directive. So you're preserving my life by letting me die. Carry out my wishes at that point. I celebrate you, Delano, because you would be preserving my life at that point.
Yes. So some of our audience members are raising questions that may perhaps delve into the realm of the legal. But in terms of thinking about advanced directives, what might happen at the conclusion of one's life if there is no advance directive?
It's not crazy on legal grounds to say that the advance directive is the relatively unimportant part here. The more important part, it's arguable legally, is the proxy. Now, proxies, I'm not a lawyer, so, but I'm in conversation so often with lawyers because these ethical and legal questions intersect. A proxy is sometimes a default proxy that is not appointed by the person whose proxy it is. States have rules about if you don't appoint somebody with durable power of attorney for healthcare that is a person to be your proxy, then the first person to be your proxy is your spouse, if they're competent, and the next person is your parent, if they're still alive and competent, and the next person after that is your child, if they're, so there's a default, there's an order of default proxy. But a default proxy is never, can rarely speak with the same moral authority as, oftentimes, sometimes they can because they're such a faithful person and knew you so well. But if you've appointed them your proxy in a clearly voluntary decision, not coerced by them or by anybody else in any way to appoint them proxy, you appointed them and you expressed in your document, because this has to be on paper to be an official appointment, that you had utter confidence in their ability to interpret what you would want. Then they have a considerable amount of authority in the situation. Now, sometimes caregivers will resist that and won't want to give them that authority, but they can actually legally get it. I mean, they can get it if they push the legal levers here. And of course, their position to make the decisions they make, if they've been appointed proxy, will be even stronger if you have a clear advance directive. Now, what is a clear advance directive? You don't remotely have a clear advance directive if you don't say what you wanted withheld or applied. It can be either way. When saying what you don't want is worthless if you don't say when you don't want it. I don't want to be resuscitated, the person will put in their advance directive. That means nothing if you don't say when you don't want to be resuscitated. So the what always has to go with the when in an advance directive. And most advance directives are not very clear on that score. But if you have a clear one, the proxy is in a more powerful situation to carry out your wishes.
Have you encountered a time during your work in which advance directives were not executed?
Yes. Yeah.
Why does that happen? How does that happen?
Well, one way it can happen is that the person, the caregivers think that if they put the advance directive front and center, that's dangerous territory because they don't know for sure that this person didn't revoke their directive. I can't ask them now. You write an advance directive 4 times when you won't be able to answer. So precisely the situation you write it for is a situation which you won't be there to tell them. But maybe in the meantime, you don't really believe that directive anymore. And you're the patient right in front of them. And so the mother of my late wife, the institution, nursing home, part of the institution that she was in, just didn't want to pay attention to her directive. And it took her lawyer son to impress upon them insistently over a matter of a year, or many months at least, that they had to pay attention to this directive. And they had to pay attention to the daughter's, his wife's, directions, because the daughter was the woman's proxy. But it took a while because institutions are legally averse, risk averse. They're worried about a suit by some other member of the family, or a suit by the elder abuse office in the state, whatever, that they haven't treated this woman properly to preserve her life. Um, Fortunately, in this case, the lawyer son-in-law did understand well why the institution was so risk averse, and was patient in just keeping at it. And finally, they agreed, and they let her die in her bed rather than hauling her out to the, or putting her up into a chair where they could spoon feed her, which they had previously been doing. And she was allowed peacefully to die in her bed. But it was a battle. And in many other cases where people don't have the resources, don't have an insistent, determined proxy, I'm sure that advance directives just get ignored. Now, legally, the matter of food and water, if I write an advance directive to stop giving me food and water by mouth when I'm in the early stages of severe dementia, because in my view of my life, it's a worse life if it doesn't end then, if it goes on into those years. Some people will argue that that's not a valid advance directive, because advance directives can't be for personal care and feeding by mouth. Oral feeding is personal care, not medical treatment. But we have advance directives for all sorts of other issues other than medical treatment. We have mental health care directives about what's to be done when I'm not competent on various other reasons, financial, et cetera, et cetera. Those are advance directives, not about medical treatment, but about a whole range of other things. So why shouldn't we be able to have advance directives about personal care if, in fact, assisted feeding here is personal care, not medical treatment? And to make the argument even more robust, one can argue that such assisted artfully manually assisted feeding, when the person can't feed themselves, is in fact equivalent to medical treatment. We think nutrition is very important medically. It's extremely important medically. We make prescriptions about nutrition all the time in medicine. So why should feeding by mouth be automatically something that's not coverable within the scope of an advance directive because it's not medical care? Well, we don't think of it as medical, but it's certainly health care. What could be more important for health than feeding? So I think there's building up a legal understanding, though it may take a while for courts to recognize this, and that's why institutions don't want to get involved in future legal cases and prospective legal cases. But I'm quite confident that in the end, it may not come quickly, courts will justify the authority, will back the authority of advance directive enforced by a faithful appointed proxy, a directive that was clear about the withholding of food and water by mouth at a certain time.
And truly, on the question about institutions, and we saw this during our previous lunch hour with Thaddeus Pope, in terms of how institutions can play a role in one's experience, and even Jessica Zitter and others have kind of talked about this in terms of institutional care and the shape of that. But in light of your forthcoming book from Oxford, like what surprised you, and what were some highlights we can look forward to from your upcoming book that's co-authored with Judith Schwartz, Thaddeus Pope, and Timothy Quill? If you can give us a sneak peek.
I've learned more in the process of working with these three wonderful colleagues, Tim Quill, Thad Pope, and Judah Schwartz. Their clinical experience from Judith and Tim and the legal knowledge of Thad have greatly expanded my understanding. And if I didn't have the benefit of conversations with them and knowing what they can bring to the table, I would be saying some quite foolish things. On the clinical front, it's just palliative care is so important. If we don't know what comfort measures can be provided to a person who stops eating and drinking in order to hasten their death, which is what the book is about, we're being foolish. And if people don't understand what that trajectory of going into, of not eating and drinking, the hunger is not the problem. The hunger dissipates in 48 hours. The stomach naturally shrinks and one is no longer hungry. I know this by personal experience because I was on a hunger strike at one point earlier in my life. And quite amazingly, I wouldn't have expected it at the time, but with the support of the people I was on strike with, obviously that support was important. But none of us were hungry after 48 hours. So in a sense, it wasn't hard for us to strike. It was extremely easy. Besides, the food we were given was crappy anyhow. But, the problem is thirst. But thirst is a real problem. And palliative care, good care for a person who voluntarily stops eating and drinking, is really important in making them comfortable later on in the process. Very important. And Tim Quill and Judah Schwartz have convinced me about it. No, they didn't have to convince me. It didn't take much effort. They just had to enlighten me about how important that was. And one of the reasons it was important for me to learn this is the two cases I was familiar with of people who stopped eating and drinking in order to shorten their lives and not get to severe dementia. They did it preemptively when they still had the capacity to make the decision. They were both very smooth cases who had very little discomfort, and they did not have palliative care support. So I was of the opinion that this was easy. Well, that got corrected very quickly.
And really on that same point, and since you identified that institutions / hospitals like are largely risk adverse in terms of like no lawsuits, how can we ensure, I'm not sure if that's the right verb, but we'll just let it stay for now. How can we ensure that boards of directors for hospitals are attuned to conversations like this and thoughts like yours in terms of respecting advanced directives, then self, now self, etc.?
Well, take the VA. The VA gets knocked a lot of places. But the VA, the Veterans Administration Hospital for the Pacific Northwest, located in Seattle, Washington, the director of palliative care and hospice, it's a combined unit, palliative care includes hospice, at the VA hospital in Seattle, is David Grunewald. He's been on a CLI program last fall, and authors 2 chapters in this forthcoming book also. But he will accept people who have advanced directives that say, stop feeding me at a certain point. He'll carry out the directive. And he's a VA director. How much more in the spotlight and a potential target of lawsuit can a person be? When I first came into conversation with David, I said, David, it's remarkable that you can do this, that you stepped forward with this. Well, he has his own personal story about why he stepped forward, which is his mother, which we heard about in that conference, CLI conference last fall. But beyond that, he said, I'm a palliative care doctor. I just need to document. I need to say exactly what I'm doing. I need to put it in the record forthrightly, not cover anything up, say why I did it, say what I did and why I did it, why I accepted this person into hospice, even though they didn't have a terminal illness. So they could plausibly be regarded as terminal because they'd started VSED, or in some other conditions, why I would, just in not a hospice situation, but a palliative care situation, say, I'm going to keep this person comfortable, even though my keeping them comfortable is what is enabling them to follow through on their decision to stop eating and drinking. Because if I wasn't helping them be comfortable with this palliative care, they might stop their decision and eat again. Am I afraid of being an assistant to a suicide when I do that? Well, sure, conceivably, maybe somebody could get me into court on that, but I'm just documenting everything. This person has a right to do it. They have a right to stop eating and drinking. I'm their physician who's supposed to be supporting them and doing the best thing I can for them. I can make them more comfortable with this palliative care. So I don't care whether I'm charged with being assisting a suicide. I'm going to defend myself.
Yeah, and I think documentation is a key word there. If you're documenting, you're not making a judgment. However, is there a sense that advance directives are in some senses up to the judge, up to the courts, more so than the person?
Well, we have very robust, Thad Pope has two beautiful chapters in his book on the legal questions about VSED, that is, a person who's competent, has decision-making capacity, stopping eating and drinking voluntarily and hastening their death that way. And then a chapter on stopping eating and drinking by advance directive implemented by a proxy. And the legal clarity on the first, the capacity of a person, the legal right of a person to stop eating and drinking now when they're competent and follow through with it, is very robust. Even though you don't have, quote, on-point decisions in which a court has said explicitly that with this kind of case. But the reason they haven't gotten cases like this is the legal precedent for a person being able to voluntarily stop eating and drinking, even if it's very consciously and deliberately a hastening of their death before they're terminally ill, otherwise, is very solid in the legal precedent. And the reason you don't have any on-point cases is nobody thinks they're going to win them. If you've got a clear direct, a clearly competent person doing this. That makes that and a number of other legal precedents very clear. As to advance directives, it's also quite clear that advance directives can incorporate things other than, strictly speaking, medical care. And that it's also quite clear that at a certain point, the extensive assistance, manual assistance in helping a person in oral feeding is so much care delivered by professionals, by people experienced in giving it, that it would be strange indeed to say that this was merely personal care given by a family member who wasn't in a professional role. Though you get into that question sometimes in home hospice. But there you just have to be clear what the role of the hospice professionals are in advising the family member who's doing part of the home care. But these are all manageable problems, but they do need to be carefully attended to. Now, we do get risk-averse institutions. I know of an institution, this is one of my places where my direct experience with a VSED case occurred. The institution is very open to allowing voluntarily stopping eating and drinking in order to hasten death to avoid prospective dementia when the person is not already terminally ill, and they're not. I mean, progressive dementia is not a terminal illness, not in the 6-month sense at least. And yet that institution is very tolerant of this behavior.
Yeah.
On the other hand, they don't want it to be advertised because they think they might get in trouble with the elder abuse office of the state they're in. And they, above all, they won't even write guidelines for their people because the guidelines could get out and then they might get sued.
Yes, yes. And one thing you're really drawing our attention to is the amazing overlaps between law and philosophy in terms of what does it mean to live. And I think that's very intriguing. We have one more slide. So, Professor, we should
the conclusion. Yes, sorry.
we should move along. No
Sure.
apologies, no apologies necessary. Very riveting.
So, summarizing, a sufficiently clear advance directive to withhold food and water in severe dementia should be followed. Emphasis on sufficiently clear, and followed probably needs to be bolstered by a faithful proxy in the situation greatly. Increases both the ethical confidence that what we're doing is right and the legal right to do it. The notion of having a life, not just being alive in a moment, is what drives the argument for the power of such an advance directive. It's what drives the argument for the moral power of any advance directive, even conventional ones, to refuse life-saving treatment. So life, not just being alive, is the sort of thing that can be completed. And that's the point at which I want to say, here it is, the Completed Life Initiative to the rescue. Because it puts front and center this notion of a life. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all of you. So many of you for attending and being patient in my time and talking.
No. It was a great delight for us. And just a quick point, and I will add this to the chat as well. But your new book is would you mind telling us again, just for audience members? I'm getting a few requests for your July book that's forthcoming.
It's edited by Timothy Quill, myself, Thaddeus Pope, and Judith Schwartz. And the title is Voluntarily Stopping Eating and Drinking, a compassionate, widely available option for hastening death. Unfortunately, the website posting at the website of Oxford University Press for this book has not yet occurred. So I can't give you a web link. It will shortly. It's being held up in the promotional process at the press right now. But it's going to be coming out in July.
We'll keep our eyes open for that. Thank you again, Professor.
Thank you all. And thank you, Delano. Thank you, Sarah.
And thank you, Professor Paul Menzel, and thank you, Professor Delano Coper. This has been a riveting, thought-provoking discussion and a really poignant distinction between having a life and not just being alive. And so I think our audience can have many takeaways from your thought-provoking discussion today. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you to our audience for your engaging and lively questions. So I want to cover briefly a few upcoming events that we're hosting this month of March at the Completed Life Initiative. This coming Tuesday, March 9th, we have our first ever community meet and greet from 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern. Please sign up and come to this event. It will not be recorded. It will be more of an informal, interactive event with members of our advisory board here at the Completed Life Initiative. So please be sure to sign up for that, and we hope to see you there. We're also looking forward to our upcoming film panel discussion with Dr. Jessica Zitter on March 16th. from 12 to 1:30 p.m. Eastern. We will be screening her new short documentary film called Caregiver, A Love Story, which is an incredibly poignant film. So we look forward to seeing you there in real time as well. And then I'm also delighted to announce our Completed Life March Symposium, which will be happening at the end of the month. Signups will be going out later today for this incredible upcoming symposium, and we're delighted to have keynote speaker Dr. BJ Miller joining us. So please keep an eye out on your email for the registration link coming soon. And without further ado, if you're on social media, Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn, please don't hesitate to tag us, #CompletedLife. We always, enjoy and engaging with you on the internet via social media. So please check us out there. And for today, so again, it's been a pleasure to spend the lunch hour with Delano and Paul, and we can't thank you enough for being here. So thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Be well.